Let's go to our Bible, shall we? Maybe turn to Joshua 22 this morning. Joshua 22, as we continue here in our series through the book of Joshua, getting close to the end now. In fact, this now begins what is the last major division of the book of Joshua. So far, I mentioned last week, 4 major divisions really encompass the entirety of the book. We've got the first division, entering the land, chapters 1 through 4, then conquering the land, chapters 5 through 12, distributing the land, chapters 13 through 21. Kind of breezed through that section last week, looking at specifically Caleb and Joshua and their allotment of the land. And then finally, coming to this last section, these final 3 chapters, we might call this retaining the land, and that's chapters 22 through 24. What might set these chapters apart and make them a connected unit is that each of these last 3 chapters begin with Joshua issuing a challenge to Israel, or to a segment of the nation of Israel. These challenges that Joshua gives here follow a summary statement of God's faithfulness to his people. That's at the end of chapter 21. If you would just look there at verses 43 through 45, kind of summarizing what has gone on up unto this point. And the Lord gave unto Israel all the land which he sware to give unto their fathers, and they possessed it and dwelt therein. And the Lord gave them rest round about, according to all that he sware unto their fathers. And there stood not a man of all their enemies before them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand. There failed not aught of any good thing which the Lord had spoken unto the house of Israel. All came to pass. So this closing summary of the first 21 chapters wants to reinforce the reality of God's faithfulness to his people. God has given them this land as he had promised he would do. God has kept his word. God is faithful. And now, by contrast, these final 3 chapters are preoccupied with the theme of Israel's faithfulness to God. So the application here is very clear. Israel must respond to the Lord's faithfulness in kind. Or in other words, because God has been faithful to Israel, they too must now be faithful to God. That's the logical, expected response of the nation of Israel, the people of God, in light of the fact that God has proven himself to be faithful. Notice how this plays out. Each chapter begins with just a word regarding God's faithfulness to Israel, and that becomes more detailed as you move through the last 3 chapters. Then the word regarding God's faithfulness is followed by a therefore. Just notice this here in chapter 22, verse 4. And now the Lord your God hath given rest unto your brethren as he promised them. Therefore, now return and get you up. Skip over to chapter 23. Look at verse 3 and then verse 6. And ye have seen all that the Lord your God hath done unto all these nations because of you, for the Lord your God is he that hath fought for you. Verse 6. Be ye therefore very courageous to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses. And then the same thing is repeated in chapter 24. Look at verse 13. And I have given you a land for which you did not labor, cities which you built not, and you dwell in them, and the vineyards and olive yards which you planted not, do you eat. Now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth. Now, the logic here is the same as that of the therefore of Romans chapter 12, which follows the divine mercies of Romans 1 through 11. Now, therefore, brethren, I beseech you by the mercies of God that you present yourself a living sacrifice. All of this can be summarized by the song that says, love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life. my all. It's a spiritual principle that the nation of Israel was to follow. And now Paul there encourages the people of God, the church, to follow. And now it behooves us to follow this principle as well. That we, because of what God has done for us, respond with faithfulness, loyalty, obedience to him. So I want to take a closer look here with you this morning at what we see taking place here in chapter 22 and considering this passage from the perspective of facing the future through faithfulness. And I think that title of this sermon could probably well summarize the last 3 chapters as a whole. And I might just leave that title for the next 2 chapters as we move through this section. But because all of this really pertains to that idea. We face the future with faithfulness. We commit ourselves to being faithful to God, particularly in light of all that God has done for us. So let's see how this works itself out here in chapter 22 of the book of Joshua. We're going to begin by considering, first of all, a challenge that encourages continued faithfulness. A challenge that encourages continued faithfulness. Now, this is a lengthy chapter. I'm not going to take the time to read through it in its entirety. We'll read some portions of it. But I do want to begin by reading through the first 6 verses, which encompasses this first point. Just kind of setting the scene a little bit with you as to what's going on in this chapter. It's an interesting chapter, at least to me it is. And it has some valuable lessons and points of application that we need to take away from what is going on here. So let's set the scene by looking at these first 6 verses. Then Joshua called the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh. And he said unto them, You have kept all that Moses the servant of the Lord commanded you, and you have obeyed my voice in all that I have commanded you. You have not left your brethren these many days unto this day, but have kept the charge of the commandment of the Lord your God. And now the Lord your God hath given rest unto your brethren, as he promised them. Therefore now return, and get you unto your tents and unto the land of your possession, which Moses the servant of the Lord gave you on the other side Jordan. But take diligent heed to do the commandment of the law which Moses the servant of the Lord charged you, to love the Lord your God, and to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments, and to cleave unto him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. And Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went unto their tents. Now, what's going on here? Before we break this section down into a couple of points, just want to take a quick look and consider what's taking place as this chapter unfolds. This passage, these 6 verses, pick up the narrative from back in chapter 1 in verses 12 through 18. If you would, just flip back there and take a look at this with me. Joshua chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. And this will kind of give us an idea of what's taking place here. Joshua chapter 1, 12 through 18 actually picks up the narrative from Numbers chapter 32. I'll make mention of what's going on there. We won't turn back to that and look at it. But look at what's taking place here. Joshua 1, verse 12. And to the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh spake Joshua, saying, Remember the word which Moses the servant of the Lord commanded you, saying, The Lord your God hath given you rest, and hath given you this land. Your wives, your little ones, your cattle shall remain in the land which Moses gave you on this side Jordan. But you shall pass before your brethren armed, all the mighty men of valor, and help them, until the Lord hath given you your brethren rest, that he hath given you, and they also have possessed the land, which the Lord your God giveth them. Then you shall return unto the land of your possession, and enjoy it, which Moses the Lord's servant gave you on this side Jordan, toward the sun rising. And they answered Joshua, saying, All that thou commandest us we will do, and whithersoever thou sendest us we will go. According as we hearken unto Moses in all things, so will we hearken unto thee. Only the Lord thy God be with thee, as he was with Moses. Whosoever he be that doth rebel against the commandment, and will not hearken unto thy words in all that thou commandest, him he shall be put to death. Only be strong and of good courage. Now, as I said, this picks up what takes place back in Numbers 32. And there what we learn is that these 2.5 tribes, tribe of Reuben, Gad, half-tribe of Manasseh, requested of Moses that they might remain on the eastern side of the Jordan River. They didn't want to cross over and go to the other side. And the reason being, as it's explained there, is that they were cattle raisers. And there was a section of land there on the eastern side that was very conducive to their occupation, raising, breeding cattle. And so they requested of Moses that they might be able to stay over on that side of the Jordan River. Now, the reason that's important and significant is obvious, that Jordan River was a boundary. The other side of the Jordan River, the western side, was the boundary of the Promised Land. So in essence, they were asking Moses that they might not have to dwell in the Promised Land, but stay on the eastern side. And so Moses agreed. Moses said, that's fine. You may do that, but you need to understand this. We have a land to conquer on the western side of the Jordan River. And so if you're going to remain on the eastern side, what you need to do is commit yourselves to helping your brethren settle the land and occupy the land, the Promised Land. If you will do that, if you'll go to war with your brethren, then once we have settled that land and occupied it, then you may take possession of your land on the eastern side. And he said to them there in that passage in Numbers 32, if you don't do that, if you fail to follow through on this, you are going to put yourself under the wrath of God. And by the way, there in that context is that familiar verse, be sure your sin will find you out. You're familiar with that. You've heard that verse before. Well, that's in that context of all of this in Numbers 32. Moses tells them, if you fail to follow through on this, be sure your sin will find you out, and you're going to be held accountable, and you're going to be judged by God if you're not faithful to what I'm commanding you to do. And so they readily agreed. They said, we'll do that. We'll leave our wives, our children, our possessions on the eastern side. We'll cross over. We'll go over onto the western side, and we'll fight for our brethren. So that's what's happening here now as we open up and begin Joshua chapter 22. Joshua is commending them for following through on their commitment, and he's giving to them now not just that word of commendation, but also a challenge, you notice here, to remain faithful to God as they go back and cross over the Jordan and begin to settle on the eastern side of the Jordan River. So I just want to make a couple of quick observation points here under this first point. Number one, I want you to see here that our faithfulness and obedience to past commitments can encourage us to continued faithfulness. Our faithfulness, our obedience in the past can encourage us in the present. And that's what we see going on here. You notice again how Joshua commends these tribes in verses 2 and 3. You've kept all Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you. You've obeyed my voice and all that I commanded you. You've not left your brethren these many days until this day, but have kept the charge of the commandments of the Lord your God. So Joshua is commending what they have done here. Now we may miss the significance of what these men have done, these 2.5 tribes. Joshua puts it, let's just say he understates their commitment. You've not left your brethren these many days. And so we might read that and think, well, okay, many days. It took a couple of months, maybe a year. No, 7 years. 7 years it took this entire process of conquering this land, ridding this land of these Canaanites. 7 long years. These 2.5 tribes have committed themselves to following through on what they agreed to do under the instruction of Moses and then Joshua back in chapter 1. Think about that. Their wives, their children remain behind. Their possessions, any homes they might have established, all of it left behind for 7 years. Now, think about the perseverance, the self-sacrifice that would entail on their part. I have no doubt that there must have been those occasions from time to time where they felt like quitting, where they might have thought to themselves, let's go back, let's go home. We've given enough time, we put forth enough effort. I'm sure there were times where they just felt like packing up and going home. But the point is, they didn't. They stayed faithful to what they had committed themselves to do. Now, don't you suppose that testimony of faithfulness will encourage them and strengthen them for the future. It should. And I think the same holds true for us as well. As we face challenges, as we go through periods of struggle and testing, and as we stay faithful and obedient throughout those periods of struggle, of testing, it will only serve to strengthen us for the next challenge. And that's often how God works in our lives. He brings us through one test after another, one challenge after another, a period of suffering, and then another period of suffering, all of which is designed to strengthen our faith, to purify our faith. And so God is working in us to accomplish this. And as we look back and as we see that we were faithful and that God has strengthened us through those periods of struggle and suffering and testing in the past, it reminds us, it encourages us, it challenges us to continue faithfully in the future. That yes, there, God met us, God strengthened us, God helped us. He will do so today. He will do so in this struggle as well. And so Joshua wants to reinforce in the hearts and the minds of these 2.5 tribes that as they were faithful these last 7 years, as they remained obedient in what was surely a struggle for them, it encourages them to continue faithfully as they move on now into this next phase of their life, crossing back over and settling their portion of the land. But I want to also place in another a thought here, another point of application that kind of balances all this. And that is this. Number 2, continued faithfulness does not rest on the past, but it builds on it. Continued faithfulness does not rest on the past, but it builds on the past. And I think this is made clear in Joshua's words here as he goes on, verse 4, picking up there. Now the Lord your God hath given rest to your brethren as he promised. Therefore, now return and get into your tents unto the land of your possession, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of Jordan. But take diligent heed to do the commandment and the law, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, charged you. Joshua knows that past faithfulness does not always lead to future faithfulness. And so he gives them this charge, this challenge, and he challenges them to live out their continued faithfulness to all that Moses had commanded them. I want you to just notice here what continued faithfulness looks like. It's fairly simple and basic. Let's just take note of what Joshua says to these 2.5 tribes. Number 1, we note here that to continue in faithfulness, we must love God. We must love God. Now, this is where faithfulness to God must begin. It springs out of a heart of love for God. And if it does not flow out of love for Him, then it becomes nothing more than duty. And just doing anything out of simple duty, in particular, trying to love God out of duty, is just going to lead to drudgery. But when we strive for faithfulness out of a love for God, then it becomes our passion. It becomes our delight, our joy. And so we need to take careful attention to maintaining, to kindling that love for God, that passion for God, that heart for God. Reminded of what Jesus had to say to the church in Ephesus in Revelation chapter 2. You remember? It says you've left your first love. And that's a dangerous place for the child of God, for the Christian to be in. To have slipped away from that passion for God, that love for God, but yet continuing to go through the motions of serving Him, of being obedient, faithful to God. We continue along going through those motions, but again, it just becomes done. It's just being done now out of a sense of duty, and before too long, we're going to find ourselves just filled with an overwhelming sense of drudgery, going through the motions when it's not done out of a deep and abiding love for God. So stay close to God. Stay in His Word. Stay in fellowship through prayer. But kindle that love. Have a heart for God, a love for God, and keep that passion for Him alive. So to continue in faithfulness, we must love God. Second, to continue in faithfulness, we must obey God. As I said, this is pretty basic, but this is what Joshua is saying here. We cannot be faithful if we're not obeying. So it begins by our love for God, and out of that love for him, as Joshua puts it here, we desire to walk in his ways and to keep his commandments. You know, this is no different than what Jesus says in John 14:15. If you love me, keep my commandments. It's a simple response. It's a necessary response. That if we truly love Jesus, love God, we're going to want to obey him. And again, that obedience is not going to be just a sense of duty. It's not going to become drudgery. Not when it's done out of love. And so, if we love him, obey him. To be faithful, we continue in obedience. And then third, to continue in faithfulness, we must serve God. As Joshua again says here, and to cleave unto him, at the end of verse 5, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. To continue in faithfulness, we must serve God. Just as we cannot be faithful to God if we are not obeying him, so too we cannot be faithful to God if we are not serving him. It's as simple as that. And that is a biblical reality that there is just no getting around for the Christian. We have got to be serving him. If we are going to be truly faithful, continuing in faithfulness, we have got to be serving him. We have been called to serve. We have been gifted to serve. We're going to be held accountable for our service. It's required in stewards, Paul tells us, that a man be found faithful. And the basic idea of a steward is that of a servant, someone who has been entrusted with an area of service and ministry. And so we're going to be held accountable for how we have lived as stewards, as servants. And that accountability is going to rest on whether or not we have been faithful in what God has given us to do as Christians. And so the challenge issued here is for these tribes to continue to be faithful in all that God has called them to do as they move forward now, as they go in to take their possession, build on this faithfulness that they have demonstrated in the past. Consider how God has shown himself faithful to them and respond with faithfulness toward him. So I think there's an important application, a takeaway for us today here as well. Respond to God's faithfulness by being faithful to him, by obeying him, by serving him. All right, well, let's go on. Number 2, as we move on in this chapter, we're going to see next a conflict that threatens continued faithfulness. A conflict that threatens continued faithfulness. Something interesting now begins to transpire as this narrative unfolds. In verses 10 through 20 or so, we read of a conflict that develops between these 2.5 tribes and the remaining 9.5 tribes of Israel that are going to stay on the western side of the Jordan River. Let me just mention here, it's instructive, I think, for us to realize and recognize that once this opposition from without, the enemies that surround them, once that has been dealt with, by and large anyway, that all has been put aside, as we read at the end of chapter 21. As I mentioned, there's still some pockets of resistance, but the major battles have been won. The major forces of the Canaanites have been quelled, have been eliminated. But now once that has happened, once that opposition has been pretty much put down, what do we see happening now? We see opposition beginning to develop from within. Here's just a good reminder of how Satan will so often operate. We know we have opposing forces from without. We know Satan and his minions are on the attack. And we may experience levels of victory over them. For the most part, we know that greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. We know we are more than conquerors through Jesus Christ our Lord. So we have victory, and we often will experience victory. But know this, just because We might be experiencing victory over the enemy that's on the outside. Doesn't mean that we've eliminated all possibility of opposition. Because Satan always will look for other ways to begin to destroy people of God. And what he might do then next is raise up opposition from within. So many churches are fractured, are experiencing levels of disunity that are just causing a weakened church. And that's the operation of Satan. That's the work of Satan, doing everything he can to oppose the people of God. And this is what happens here. Right after, isn't that interesting? Right after the enemy has been put down, the opposition from without has been pretty much eliminated. Opposition from within begins to rear up. A misunderstanding develops that has the potential of bringing conflict and destroying the unity of the people of God. In this case, it revolves around the building of an altar by these 2.5 tribes as they begin to head back now to the other side of the Jordan River. Look at verse 10. And when they came unto the borders of Jordan that are in the land of Canaan, the children of Reuben and the children of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh built there an altar by Jordan, a great altar, to see to. Now note what happens at verse 11 and 12. And the children of Israel, the remaining tribes, of course, heard, saying, Behold, the children of Reuben, the children of Gad, and half-tribe of Manasseh have built an altar over against the land of Canaan, in the borders of Jordan, at the passage of the children of Israel. And when the children of Israel heard it, the whole congregation of the children of Israel gathered themselves together at Shiloh to go up to war against them. So you can see the seriousness of this issue. At least 2 things here I want you to notice regarding the threat all of this imposes to the faithfulness now of these 2.5 tribes. Number 1, faithfulness can be threatened when our motives are misjudged. Faithfulness can be threatened when our motives are misjudged. Now you notice here what's happening. These 2.5 tribes build this giant altar at the place where they are crossing over the Jordan River. Now why is this a problem? I'm glad you asked, because I'm going to tell you. The reason this is a problem takes us back to Deuteronomy chapter 12. Here Moses is giving instruction to the people of God, just as they are now making ready to enter into the promised land. And Deuteronomy chapter 12 focuses on the worship of God's people. It begins by telling the people of Israel that as they go into the land, they need to eliminate all altars to any foreign gods, the gods of the Canaanites. Break them down, destroy them. And then it goes on and explains why this is so important. And I'll just pick it up and read a couple of verses here. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. Here's what it says. Take heed to thyself that thou offer not thy burnt offerings in every place that thou seest. But in the place where the Lord shall choose, in one of thy tribes, there thou shalt offer thy burnt offerings, and there thou shalt do all that I command thee. All right, so the command is very simple, very basic to understand. Moses is saying God has instructed us that as you go into the land, destroy every altar, eliminate any possibility of worship to any false gods, and then God is going to show you where he wants an altar erected to his name. And so you're going to be given this one place, this one location where you are to build an altar, and where all the nations, all the tribes, I should say, are going to come to this one altar, and there they will offer their sacrifices to God. Now, why does God do that? Why is that so important? Well, obviously, he doesn't want these tribes just kind of, deciding willy-nilly where they're going to put an altar. Oh, this looks like a good spot. Let's build an altar here. Someone else, well, this looks like a good spot. We'll put an altar over here. And just having all these various altars where people can do their own thing, where they can bring their sacrifices, bring their offerings. And so, what begins to happen? Well, for one thing, you still have Canaanites living in the land. So now you've got you run the risk of beginning to incorporate some of their practices along with your own worship system. And that is exactly what happens, as you know, the ongoing history of Israel. That's exactly what happens. As a reminder from the warning of God here, that this will be a problem to you if you just put up all these altars and do your own thing. And I got to thinking about that, and it kind of applied to, in my thinking anyway, to the purpose of the church. That God has instituted these local churches. So, as a people of God, we're just not all off doing our own thing. All just kind of establishing our own little house churches and worshiping in our own way and teaching the Bible in our own way. So much false teaching can be mingled in when the people of God start doing that. And by the way, that's kind of become an issue in today's church. We're seeing that very thing happening. But God has instituted the local church for a reason. There's a system of checks and balances that are put in place here. I check you, you check me. I hopefully balance you, you balance me. There's a give and take, there's a back and forth here. If I start deviating from this book, then you call me out on that and set me straight. If I see you deviating, getting involved in false teaching, then I'm going to set you straight on that. And so there's a reason why God has established the local church and why we need to be committed to the local church so we can have that accountability. It's the same principle, in essence, that God is establishing here with the nation of Israel. One place of worship, and that would help to prevent apostasy and the mingling in of false religions. This was preventative to protect the pure worship of the people of God. So, what happens? These western tribes get wind of this altar that was being established by these 2.5 eastern tribes. Now, let me just mention here, these tribes are to be commended for their zeal. They demonstrate tremendous zeal for the worship of God. At first hint that this might be compromised, they were stirred up to take some action to prevent this from happening. But with that said, I want you to notice here that they make a major mistake in forming opinions and passing judgment based on mere outward appearance. And they misjudge the motives of these 2.5 tribes. Let's pick it up. We left it off at the possibility of war. Fortunately, before war happens, these tribes send a contingency to speak with these 2.5 tribes. They send Eleazar in verse, well, it's there somewhere. They send Eleazar, they send some other leaders from these various tribes. Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, is sent. Verse 13. Other leaders from each of the tribes are sent. Verse 14. 10 princes all head off to speak with these tribes. Now look at verses 16 and verse 16. Thus saith the whole congregation of the Lord, what trespass is this that you have committed against the Lord God of Israel, to turn away this day from following the Lord, and that you have builded you an altar, that you might rebel this day against the Lord. So they just assume that's why they built this altar. They're going to sacrifice on it. It's going to lead to, well, not lead to, it is rebellion, because God commanded one altar only. Verse 18, but that you must turn away this day from following the Lord, and it will be, seeing you rebel today against the Lord, that tomorrow he will be wroth with the whole congregation of Israel. Now, I could say a lot trying to develop all this, but let me just try and summarize and make a point of application here, because I think it's very important. They jump to conclusions as to what the motives of these 2.5 tribes are in building this altar. They immediately assume it's rebellion against God. And they immediately then jump to the conclusion that God is angry and God's going to pour out his wrath down upon you. Now, as of yet, we don't know what the motivation is That's going to be revealed a little later on. We'll see that when we get to that final point here. But for now, all we need to know is they're jumping to these conclusions. They falsely accuse these 2.5 tribes based on what they assume to be their motives. Can you see the kind of damage that this can do? When we misjudge motives, when we make accusatory statements without knowing all the facts, without, first of all, getting to the bottom of things, finding out why they did this, why they said that, but rather just jump to conclusions, make accusations, so much harm can be done to people. And I'm not suggesting that, that gives an excuse for anyone to turn away from the Lord, to leave a church or whatever it might be. But I'm sure it's happened, that people have been falsely accused, their motives have been misjudged, they've been maligned, they've been attacked, and they decide, you know what, if that's how the people of God are going to treat me, I want nothing to do with them. I'm not saying that's right, but it happens. All because someone decided, you know what, I'm not going to get to the bottom of this. I'm not going to take the time to investigate this. I'm going to make my own judgment based on what the appearance of things seem to be. And that's what's happening here. That's exactly what this fella Phinehas and these other leaders are doing in making these accusatory statements. You're rebelling against God, they say. And our faithfulness can be threatened when our motives are misjudged. But let me make another point here. Number 2, faithfulness can be threatened when our unity is jeopardized. And that's ultimately what is at stake in all of this. The people's unity is under threat. They were ready to go to war over this issue. Fortunately, before warfare would begin, this party was sent out to seek reconciliation. This is one reason why unity is stressed over and over again in Scripture. Because without it, faithfulness is hindered. And so we need to protect unity at all costs. And that's what we're going to see here. Let's wrap this up, all right? I know I'm getting out of time here. Let's go to a third point. Let me try and move through this a little more quickly. Number 3, I want you to see this: a commitment that preserves continued faithfulness. Verses 21 through 34. I don't need to take a lot of time on this, but I just want you to see this here. A commitment is being made here by these 2.5 tribes for the purpose of continued faithfulness, at least in 3 areas. Number 1, there is a commitment to protect the unity of the nation. They're making a commitment here to protect this unity that the building of this altar has jeopardized, but the reason they built the altar was to protect it. So their motives were so misjudged that the reason they built the altar in the first place became, exactly what happened. They built it for unity, and instead it just about destroyed the unity of these tribes. Look at what they say. Now let's pick it up at verse 24, and we begin to see their explanation as to why they built this altar. And if we have not rather done it for fear of this thing, saying, in time to come, your children might speak unto our children, saying, what have ye to do with the Lord God of Israel? For the Lord hath made Jordan a border between us and you, ye children of Reuben and children of Gad. Ye have no part in the Lord, so shall your children make our children cease from fearing the Lord. Now here in essence is what they're saying. They say, we fear the time will come when your children are going to say to our children, you have nothing to do with us. You're not in the promised land. You're on the other side of the Jordan. You don't have a love for God. You're not a true worshiper of God. Now, it might have been good if they recognized this back in Numbers 32, but that day has come and gone. But now they're realizing that this could jeopardize the future of the unity of the nation. And so they're saying, we're building this altar to keep the nation united, so that your children will look at that altar and know that we are a part of the people of God. And so they're doing this to protect the unity. We don't want your children to look at us one day, at our children, and to think we're not included among the people of God. And so verses 26 and 27 go on to state that the very presence of this altar is to be a silent witness, that those on the eastern side of the Jordan River had every right to be included with the people of God. Let's pick it up there, 26. Therefore we said, let us build an altar, not for burnt offering, not for sacrifice, but that it may be a witness between us and you and our generation after us, that we might do the service of the Lord before him with our burnt offerings, our sacrifices, our peace offerings. And your children may not say to our children in time to come, you have no part in the Lord. This is going to be a silent witness. They recognize the importance of unity. And so they believe that this altar would be that ongoing witness that they too are part of the people of God. They wanted to protect the unity of the nation. That was their motive behind this. Number two, there's a commitment to continue walking in the ways of God. Let's just note it quickly. Verse 28. Therefore, said we, that it shall be when they should say to us in our generation in time to come, that we may say again, behold the pattern of the altar of the Lord, which our fathers made, not for burnt offerings nor for sacrifices, but as a witness between us and you. God forbid that we should rebel against the Lord and turn this day from following the Lord. They're committed to walking in the ways of God, to following the Lord. And this is again, a witness to their intention to future ongoing obedience. And then number three, there is a commitment to maintain the pure worship of God. A commitment to maintain the pure worship of God. And this permeates the entirety of their statement that we see recorded here in verses 21 through 29. Over and over again, they state that this altar is not for the purpose of sacrifices and offerings. They're not going to sacrifice on this. They're not going to bring offerings to this. They realize there is only one place, one designated place. And this is just a reminder of that there is a place for them to go and to offer their sacrifices to God. But it's not going to be this altar. The end of verse 29, notice how they wrap this up. We did not build an altar for burnt offerings, for meat offerings, or for sacrifices, besides the altar of the Lord our God that is before his tabernacle. Or again, in essence, we're not going to offer sacrifices any place other than that one altar that has been designated for those sacrifices. In other words, they're committed to the pure worship of God. They're not going to deviate from that. They're committed to faithfulness. All of this here is demonstrated to that effect. That they're committed to continued faithfulness to God. And if building this altar could help them with that, then they believe that this was the right thing to do and important to do. Now, we could argue the wisdom of their doing this, but that really is beside the point. In their minds, this was a necessary witness, ongoing testimony to what they want the other tribes on the other side of Jordan to realize about them, that they are a part of the people of God. And so, as the story concludes, we see that the committee that was sent to investigate is satisfied with their explanation, verses 30 through 34. And so they bless God for causing his people to rule, for causing his peace to rule among his people. Boy, what damage could have been done. But here's a people, 2.5 tribes of people who were committed to faithfulness to God. And they did whatever they felt was necessary in order to establish that, to secure that. And so I close out with this thought that our own desire should be similar. That we too would face the future with that desire, that commitment to be faithful to what God has called us to be and to do. And I trust that's true for each of us, that we would continue forward in faithfulness to God.